Before there were borders, religions, or nations, the land itself already mattered. The area that would later be called Israel lies at a geological crossroads. It sits along a major fault system known as the Jordan Rift Valley, part of a long fracture that runs from Africa into the Middle East. This shaped the land into sharp contrasts over a very small distance: fertile valleys beside desert, hills rising from coastal plains, and access to both land and sea routes. Because of this geography, the region became a natural bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Trade routes passed through it, armies passed through it, ideas passed through it. Where geography funnels people, history tends to accumulate. Some of the earliest farming communities in human history developed in this wider region, often described as part of the Fertile Crescent. The climate allowed early cultivation of wheat, barley, olives, and grapes. Seasonal rains, river valleys, and access to trade meant people could grow food, store it, and exchange it. These early settlements were not one people or culture. They rose, declined, merged, and changed over thousands of years. Identity in this period was fluid, shaped by land, survival, and movement rather than fixed borders. In ancient times, the region was often called Canaan. It was home to many different groups, including peoples later known as Canaanites and Philistines. Archaeology shows towns, trade networks, and cultural exchange rather than a single unified population. Over time, small communities emerged in the hill country. These groups developed shared customs and stories that set them apart from surrounding populations. Gradually, they came to be identified as Israelites. From this point onward, two kinds of history begin to run alongside each other. One comes from religious tradition, preserved in sacred texts and oral memory. The other comes from archaeology and historical analysis based on physical evidence. They don't always align neatly, but together they shape how the past is understood. What matters most is that by this stage, the idea of a people connected to this land had begun to form. Not a modern nation, but a shared identity rooted in place, memory, and survival. That idea of peoplehood tied to land will echo through everything that follows. As this shared identity developed, one story came to sit at its very center: the story of Moses and the Exodus. According to Jewish religious tradition, the Israelites lived in Egypt as an oppressed people, eventually reduced to slavery. Moses is raised in Egypt, but later called to lead his people out. This calling begins with one of the most well-known moments in the tradition: the burning bush, a fire that burns without consuming the plant. It represents authority, presence, and endurance. Moses confronts the ruler of Egypt and demands the release of the Israelites. When this demand is refused, a sequence of escalating disasters follows, traditionally remembered as the 10 plagues. These include plagues of disease, darkness, and locusts, and finally the death of the firstborn. After this final catastrophe, the Israelites are allowed to leave. Whether taken as literal history or symbolic narrative, the Exodus story is foundational. It defines the Israelites as a people shaped by oppression, resistance, and liberation. Freedom is not accidental in this tradition, it is central. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites wander in the wilderness. During this period, Moses receives laws said to be carved into stone tablets. Stone matters symbolically. It represents permanence, memory, and something not easily altered. These laws become the basis of Jewish religious life and communal responsibility. One of the most distinctive markers of that identity is male circumcision. In Judaism, this is not a medical practice, but a symbolic one, a physical sign of belonging to a covenant and a people. It applies only to males, and there is no equivalent practice for women in Jewish law. Other religions later adopt circumcision for different reasons, while Christianity moves away from physical markers entirely. This combination of story, law, and physical identity allows Jewish culture to survive even without political power. A people can lose land, cities, and armies, but still remain a people. Over time, the Israelites settle in the land. Jerusalem becomes a spiritual and political center, and later traditions speak of temples that anchor worship, law, and identity. From this point on, the land is no longer just a place to live. It becomes a symbol of continuity, faith, and belonging. That deep connection between story, law, and land is what carries Jewish identity forward into the centuries ahead, even as empires rise and fall around it. Centuries passed, the land became caught between empires. Large powers rose and fell across the region. Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and later Greek-influenced kingdoms. Each brought new rulers, new systems, and new pressures. Some allowed local customs to continue, others imposed control by force. During these periods, Jewish communities experienced cycles of destruction, exile, and return. Some people were taken from the land, others remained. What developed was not a clean break, but a pattern of partial loss and survival. Under Babylonian rule, Jerusalem was destroyed and many Jews were exiled. Later, under Persian rule, some returned and rebuilt. This reinforced a powerful idea that loss of land did not mean loss of identity, and that return was always possible. Eventually, the region fell under Roman control. Roman rule was efficient, heavy-handed, and often brutal. Tensions grew between imperial authority and local religious life. During this Roman period lived Jesus, a Jewish preacher in Roman-controlled Judea. His teachings following emerged from within Jewish society, and the early debates around him were internal. Crucifixion, the method of execution described in Christian tradition, was a Roman punishment used to enforce imperial order. Over time, Christianity spread beyond its Jewish origins and became a separate religion. In later centuries, a harmful idea took hold in parts of Christian Europe, that Jews as a group were responsible for Jesus' death. This belief had no basis in historical reality, but it became a powerful justification for discrimination and violence. Meanwhile, Jewish revolts against Roman rule were crushed. The Second Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Many Jews were killed, displaced, or sold into slavery. Jewish life in the land did not disappear, but it was deeply weakened. As a result, Jewish communities became increasingly dispersed across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. This widening dispersion became known as the diaspora. At the same time, other peoples continued to live on the land continuously. Farming villages, towns, and trade networks remained. The land was never empty, even as different empires claimed control. From this point onward, the region carried multiple overlapping histories, a Jewish memory of loss and longing, and the lived reality of those who remained on the land generation after generation. This overlap, never fully resolved, would later become one of the deepest sources of conflict. As Jewish communities spread across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, they lived as minorities inside other societies. Sometimes they were tolerated, sometimes they were protected, often they were restricted. In many parts of medieval Europe, Jews were barred from owning land or joining craft guilds. These restrictions were not accidental. Land ownership and guild membership were sources of power, and excluding Jews kept them dependent and controllable. As a result, many Jews were pushed into occupations that were portable and urban: trade, administration, scholarship, and money lending. Religious rules in Christian societies discouraged Christians from charging interest to other Christians, while Jewish law allowed lending to non-Jews. This made Jews visible in financial roles, even though most lived in poverty. When taxes rose or rents increased, Jews were often the visible collectors rather than the decision makers. This made them convenient targets for resentment. Over time, stereotypes formed that confused enforced economic roles with moral character. These stereotypes hardened into prejudice. Violence flared repeatedly: expulsions from England, France, Spain, and parts of Germany, pogroms in Eastern Europe, ghettos imposed in cities across the continent. Each time, Jewish communities rebuilt elsewhere, carrying language, customs, and memory with them. Despite persecution, Jewish culture placed a strong emphasis on literacy, debate, and learning. Religious life required reading and interpretation. Over generations, this produced high levels of education compared with surrounding populations. This visibility in learning and certain professions later fed another dangerous idea: that Jews were powerful or manipulative, even though their position was often precarious and insecure. By the modern period, a pattern had been set. Jews were present across many societies, contributing to them, yet never fully safe within them. Success did not guarantee acceptance. Integration did not guarantee protection. This long history of survival without sovereignty planted a quiet but persistent question: what would it take for a people to be secure in their own right? That question would take on new urgency as the modern world began to form. By the 19th century, the world around Jewish communities was changing rapidly. Industrialization, nationalism, and new political ideas were reshaping Europe and the Middle East. Old empires were weakening, and people increasingly defined themselves by nation, language, and ethnicity rather than religion alone. For Jews, this created both opportunity and danger. In some countries, Jews gained civil rights and access to education. Many moved into cities, universities, science, medicine, journalism, and industry. For the first time, some Jewish families felt they could fully belong. At the same time, a new form of anti-Semitism emerged. It was no longer only religious, it was racial, political, and conspiratorial. Jews were accused of being outsiders even when they were citizens, accused of controlling finance, culture, or politics, and blamed for social change that frightened others. These accusations often contradicted each other. Jews were described as both capitalists and revolutionaries, both powerful and corrupting, both invisible and everywhere. The logic didn't matter, the fear did. In Eastern Europe, anti Semitism turned violent. Pogroms destroyed entire communities. In Western Europe, it became embedded in politics and media. One infamous example was the Dreyfus Affair in France, where a Jewish army officer was falsely convicted of treason, revealing how fragile Jewish acceptance really was. Out of this climate emerged a new idea: Zionism. Zionism argued that Jews were not only a religious group, but a people, and that without a homeland of their own, they would always remain vulnerable. For some, this was a cultural idea. For others, it was political. For many, it was a last resort. The idea of returning to the historic land of Israel gained traction, not because life there was easy, but because life elsewhere felt unsafe. This was not a universal Jewish belief. Many Jews opposed Zionism, believing in integration or religious waiting for redemption. But as pressure increased, support grew. As the 20th century approached, the question was no longer theoretical, it was becoming urgent. The urgency of the Jewish question intensified with the outbreak of the First World War. The war shattered empires across Europe and the Middle East. Among them was the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the region containing Palestine for centuries. When the Ottomans collapsed, the land did not become independent. Instead, it passed into the hands of imperial powers. Britain emerged from the war in control of Palestine under what became known as the British Mandate. At the same time, Britain had made a series of promises that would soon collide. To Jewish leaders, Britain issued a declaration supporting the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. To Arab leaders, Britain had made commitments suggesting support for independence and self-rule after the war. Both sides believed they had been promised the same land. During the Mandate period, Jewish immigration increased, driven by persecution in Europe and the growing appeal of Zionism. New towns were built, agriculture was developed, and institutions were formed. At the same time, Arab Palestinian communities feared displacement and loss of political control in a land they had lived on for generations. Tensions rose steadily. Riots, strikes, and armed clashes broke out between communities and against British rule itself. Britain struggled to govern a territory with two national movements pulling in opposite directions. As the 1930s progressed, anti-Semitism in Europe escalated dramatically. Jews were stripped of rights, attacked, and pushed out of public life. Many tried to flee, but few countries were willing to take them in. Palestine increasingly came to be seen not just as a homeland, but as a refuge. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Britain faced violence from all sides: Arab revolts, Jewish underground groups, and the growing weight of international pressure. The Mandate was becoming ungovernable. As the Second World War approached, the unresolved conflict in Palestine was no longer a local problem. It was becoming part of a global crisis, one that would soon overwhelm every calculation made before it. The Second World War changed everything. Nazi Germany turned long-standing anti-Semitism into state policy. Across Europe, Jews were isolated, stripped of rights, deported, and murdered. Entire communities were wiped out. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews were dead. For survivors, the reality was stark. Families were gone. Homes were destroyed. Many had nowhere to return to, and even where return was possible, safety was not guaranteed. The Holocaust shattered the belief that assimilation alone could protect Jewish communities. The idea of a Jewish homeland was no longer theoretical. For many, it became existential. As the war ended, Britain found itself exhausted economically and politically. It faced violence in Palestine, pressure from Jewish groups seeking statehood, resistance from Arab Palestinians, and growing international concern over displaced Jewish survivors. Unable to resolve the situation, Britain handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a plan to partition the land into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. Jewish leaders accepted the plan in principle, seeing it as an imperfect but necessary step towards sovereignty. Arab leaders rejected it, arguing that it violated the rights of the existing majority population. Violence broke out almost immediately. Civil war erupted between Jewish and Arab communities even before Britain formally withdrew. In May 1948, as the British Mandate ended, Israel declared independence. Neighboring Arab states invaded. Israel survived the war and expanded beyond the boundaries proposed by the UN plan. When the fighting stopped, armistice lines were drawn, not borders, but ceasefire lines. Around 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes. Palestinians call this the Nakba, meaning catastrophe. Many ended up in refugee camps that still exist today. At the same time, Jewish refugees arrived in Israel from Europe and from Arab countries where Jewish communities faced hostility or expulsion. Two peoples emerged from the same moment, carrying opposing traumas, each rooted in loss, fear, and displacement. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It was now embedded in the land itself. In the years after independence, Israel existed in a state of constant tension. Surrounded by hostile neighbors and absorbing large numbers of refugees, the new state focused on survival. Its economy was fragile, its borders insecure, and its population growing rapidly. At the same time, Palestinians found themselves divided and stateless. Those who had fled or been expelled in 1948 were not allowed to return. The West Bank came under Jordanian control, and Gaza under Egyptian control. No independent Palestinian state was created. This unresolved situation set the stage for further conflict. In the mid-1950s, Israel fought Egypt during the Suez Crisis, a brief but significant war tied to control of the Suez Canal and regional power struggles. Although Israel withdrew, the episode confirmed that the region was a focal point of global politics. A decade later came the Six-Day War. In 1967, Israel fought Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In just 6 days, Israel captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. This war transformed the conflict completely. For the first time, Israel controlled territories where millions of Palestinians lived. What had once been a refugee problem outside Israel's borders now became an issue of military occupation inside them. For Israelis, the war was seen as a defensive victory that ensured survival. For Palestinians, it marked the beginning of life under occupation. International diplomacy followed. United Nations resolutions called for withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for peace, but interpretations differed and implementation stalled. Over time, Israeli settlements began to expand in the occupied territories. Palestinians saw this as permanent encroachment. Israelis saw it through lenses of security, history, and religion. The conflict shifted from wars between states to a struggle over land, rights, and control between two peoples living side by side, but not as equals. The map had changed. The question of what the land should become had not been answered. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the conflict was no longer mainly between armies. It had shifted toward people living under occupation. In the late 1980s, a mass Palestinian uprising broke out in the West Bank and Gaza. This became known as the First Intifada. It involved protests, strikes, civil disobedience, and at times violence. Israeli forces responded with arrests, curfews, and force. For many Israelis, the uprising was a shock. It challenged the idea that the occupation could be managed quietly or indefinitely. For Palestinians, it was a moment of collective resistance after years of political invisibility. Out of this period came a dramatic change. In the early 1990s, secret negotiations led to what became known as the Oslo Accords. For the first time, Israel and the Palestinian leadership formally recognized each other. The agreements created the Palestinian Authority and allowed limited Palestinian self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. The idea was that trust would grow over time, leading to a final agreement. But the hardest issues were postponed. Borders, settlements, refugees, Jerusalem, and security were all left unresolved. As time passed, trust eroded. Violence continued. Israeli settlement expansion did not stop. Palestinian politics became fragmented. Extremists on both sides worked to undermine compromise. By the early 2000s, a second wave of violence erupted. Suicide bombings, shootings, and military operations hardened attitudes on both sides. Many Israelis concluded that peace offers led only to more attacks. Many Palestinians concluded that negotiations led only to deeper occupation. At the same time, Israel fought a war in Lebanon against Hezbollah, a non state armed group supported by regional powers. This marked a shift toward conflicts fought through militias, rockets, and asymmetric warfare, rather than conventional armies. By the mid 2000s, the hope that Oslo would naturally evolve into peace had largely collapsed. What remained was a deepening sense on both sides that the conflict was becoming permanent. Stop when you're ready, say do part 10. Here is part 10 only, again about 2.5, 3 minutes, written for spoken flow. Continuing directly from part 9, I'll stop cleanly at the end. The Making of Israel, part 10. In the years that followed, the focus of the conflict increasingly shifted to Gaza. In the mid 2000s, Israel withdrew its settlers and permanent military presence from Gaza. The withdrawal was unilateral and did not include a final political agreement. Soon after, Hamas took control of the territory. From that point on, Gaza became isolated under a system of restrictions imposed by Israel, with Egypt also controlling its border. Israel argued these measures were necessary for security. Palestinians expressed them as collective punishment and confinement. Repeated rounds of fighting followed. Rockets were fired into Israel. Israeli airstrikes and ground operations hit Gaza. Each cycle caused civilian suffering, destruction, and trauma without resolving the underlying issues. Meanwhile, the West Bank followed a different path. The Palestinian Authority retained limited control in some areas, while Israeli settlements continued to expand. Daily life became defined by checkpoints, permits, and unequal legal systems. International diplomacy continued, but momentum faded. The idea of a two-state solution remained official policy for many governments, yet practical steps toward it slowed or stopped. One phrase began to appear more often in protests and political speech: from the river to the sea. Geographically, it refers to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Politically, it carries very different meanings. Some use it to express a demand for freedom and equal rights across the entire territory. Others use it to call for the replacement of Israel with a Palestinian state. Because of this ambiguity, many Jews and Israelis hear the phrase as a call for Israel's elimination, while others insist it is a slogan of liberation, not destruction. The argument over the phrase reflects the deeper struggle over land, sovereignty, and whose future is being imagined. In the present moment, wars in Gaza, protests in the West, and rising polarization have made the conflict more visible than ever. For many people, Israel and Jews are emotionally linked, even when they are not the same. This has led to genuine humanitarian protest, but also to renewed anti Semitism, sometimes openly and sometimes disguised as politics. At the same time, many Jews publicly oppose the actions of the Israeli government, showing that Jewish identity itself is not a single political position. Looking ahead, there is no clear resolution. Some argue for two states, others for one shared state. Some expect the conflict to continue without settlement. Israel remains a modern state built on ancient memory. Palestinians remain a people seeking full self-determination. The story is unfinished.
Thank you for listening. If you like my channel, please like, share and subscribe.